Welcome. We are here, Coffee and Conversation AI in Healthcare. I'm Jen Hand from Informatica, and we are here today with Dr. Keith Grimes. So thank you, Keith, for coming on to our inaugural episode.
Yeah, Jen, thank you very much. And I'm afraid, being a Brit, I don't have coffee, I have a cup of tea. But I think the principle's the same, isn't it? So
Exactly the same. As long as you got a mug, you're good.
Yeah, hot drink.
So you have a really interesting background, and just to give the viewers some context, you founded two companies, Curistica and VR Doctors. You're an advisor to three digital health platforms, Noetic, Patient Plus, and Flow Neuroscience. You were the director of clinical product for AI services at Babylon. And really interesting, you were also a physician. You are a physician, but spent 20 years on the front lines of primary care. And of course, you still managed to find time to speak on AI in healthcare. So what I wanted to dive into today is your role as a physician, since it's not often that we get someone who is a doctor, but also very AI savvy. And in our industry today, I think there's a lot of talk on AI as a burden to physicians. So how it can be challenging for doctors to adopt new tech in fear that it'll end up just creating more work for them. And I know at Curistica, your company, you do exactly this. So I'd love to hear, how do you get clinicians excited about adopting new ideas, especially related to health tech and AI?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing that I do, or maybe the first thing that I do that maybe makes it a little bit easier for me to try and generate interest and excitement in other clinicians is that I am one myself. As you said, I've been a GP, a general practitioner in the UK for 23 years now. And whilst I do mostly digital health and innovation work now, for the thick end of 20 years of that, I was doing it almost full time, running very busy practices. So I know what it's like on the front line. I know what it's like to practice medicine, and I know about the reality of practicing in a busy environment. And as such, when I speak to doctors or other healthcare professionals, I have an understanding of what their work environment is as well. So whenever I'm talking about technologies that I either use myself or I'm proposing to be used, I can ground it in my personal experience. I know what has worked for me in the past, what hasn't worked for me in the past, and I'm open and honest about that. You know, I love my technology, don't get me wrong, but I equally appreciate that what I might find exciting just because it's tech is actually going to be a hindrance for someone else. So I can speak their language. I've been there before. I remain there. And so I can try and ground it in place. And then being a doctor, I'm also very used to explaining quite complex topics, principally medical, to patients and their families. And actually, that's a transferable skill if you're also very interested in technology, such as artificial intelligence or the world of products, is that you have to kind of translate these to other people as well without losing any of the meaning as well. So a combination of knowing a lot about the environment, and then also knowing a reasonable amount about the technology and be able to speak to them and answer honestly. I can look in their eyes, and they can also be honest in their own concerns as well. I think that goes a long way. I'm also quite an excitable person, so you add that on top of it. But it starts with having that common understanding.
So your excitement and enthusiasm naturally lends itself to getting other people excited and enthused about products, which is great, because I think as a physician, I imagine it can be challenging. You're busy, you have patients to see, there's protocols you have to follow, and having to then learn something else or adopt something else, or just, there's always that learning curve with new tech. So you're able to essentially speak from your own experience of, hey, I know what it's like, and meeting them where they are to then help them overcome that.
Yeah. And also, I often say that, I would use technology and do use technology, even if it makes my life harder. Like, I just love it. So I'll do that. Now, that's not to say that we should adopt technologies that make life harder. But what that means is that I've actually got a much higher threshold for trying things out when they're fresher, less well designed for the place they're meant to be in place. I'm happy to kind of absorb that discomfort while I ground this new technology or new ideas in real world practice, knock off some of the rough edges, work with teams to develop a solution that is operating more smoothly, and then hand it over as well. So, my sort of higher pain threshold with regards to that is helpful too.
Yeah, I would love to look at, in an ideal world where AI is implemented seamlessly and utilized in the most ideal way possible to allow a doctor to practice at the top of their game without any burden, let's say. So what would that look like for you as a physician in the day-to-day practice and management of your patients?
Yeah, and so interestingly, I think what it would feel like is it would feel like medicine as it used to be practiced. Now, I've been practicing for a while. I don't consider myself that aged a doctor, but I suppose actually I have been doing it for a little while, and I still recall times as a general practitioner, the bits where my role as a doctor really went very, very nicely is when I was being a doctor and a patient was being a patient, we were having a conversation. It was that human contact. And then over time, all the other burdens have come in on top. So in an ideal world, I would first of all like all those burdens to come away and to free me up to do that thing that I was trained to do, that is the sort of the most important part of that connection between a healthcare practitioner and a person and their patient, to be freed up to have that conversation. So in an ideal world, I'd like AI to melt into the background as much as possible and to be a co-pilot, to assist, to document the conversation, to take the notes, to structure the notes, to be available if I need to ask questions, to refresh things, questions of the patient's data, questions of the corpus of medical knowledge, be always listening to check my practice to see that my practice is up to date and appropriate for that person, and act as a polite sort of assistant in that regard. I think that will be very, very helpful. And that's just when I'm speaking with the patient. Then there's also the AI being present in the absence. So the AI representing the patient when the patient isn't there, as in I can ask questions and do work when the patient's not there to assist them, in the same way that the AI can represent me when I'm not available to the patient as well. And in fact, I think in an ideal world, we move to a sort of position where it becomes not so much a two-way conversation as a sort of three-way conversation with this polite third person, the AI and the data being there that we can talk about, talk to, and so on. I think that's maybe quite a high-level look at it, but it's kind of a augmented, old-fashioned way of practice is what I'm looking forward to.
I love that analogy of the third person, because you can very easily visualize that the doctor, the patient, and then there's this sort of like the triangle, the point that then connects both, and it connects all three. And I think that's an easy visual, because we can look at AI as something else when it really is a connection point. It's a tool that then allows you to almost go back to what practicing used to be like, because now it's, you have 10-15 minutes with your doctor, it's rushed, it's hurried, you don't quite have time for anything. So not only benefiting you as the physician, but also the patient. And I know there's lots of talk in the industry about that, but I like that visual to just look at it as like, oh, that's the triangle, that's the point where it connects. So I think with you being a medtech innovator and almost a pioneer in the industry for the last 30 years, I know you've campaigned tirelessly before the industry is what it is today, before the pandemic, before the acceptance of digital health and the explosion as we've seen it. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on, if we've reached the tipping point, where do you see, so we're 2023, in 2028, where do you see this acceptance being in the next 5 years? I know it's a little bit of speculation, but I'm curious to hear what you think.
Well, I'm very, very happy to talk about that side of things. I think you're right. It's taken a long time. I think that it's unlikely that we're going to have like one moment where we weren't using it and then we were, and so on. There's constantly new boundaries being broken. And then what I've found with technology over the years is that something which seems very new and like will never make it into practice, makes it into practice. And then almost immediately, people forget that it's technology at all, and it's kind of always been there. And sort of good examples of which are things like even sort of prescription support, some of these sort of expert systems that doctors use to check interactions and so on. The time was that this wasn't present, and time was when, people were saying, well, we couldn't possibly use a machine to assist that. And of course, now my practice is massively underpinned by this. Automatically checking interactions. I just realized that I don't even think of it as being like a form of AI or anything. It's just there. So I think whatever happens in 2028, 5 years from now, we'll still be thinking of some things as, oh, I don't know whether that's going to come into place. And then we'll be using much more advanced technologies that have melted into the background. So I suppose the question then is, what's kind of melted into the background at that point? What's going to be in there at that point? So I still think that I recently gave a talk about what lessons could digital health learn from the pandemic. And I kind of did a report card. I scored artificial intelligence quite harshly because artificial intelligence promised a lot, but kind of under-delivered, or at least under-delivered in the way that we expected it to deliver. So in some ways in 2028, we might still say the same, except for the fact that we have large language models available now, or progressing very quickly. So it makes it difficult to predict exactly how they're going to be used. There are some barriers along the way, and these are important barriers, or rather, challenges, one of which is regulatory compliance, that we're going to have to go past. But I think by 2028, some of those problems will have been principally removed. And so I think we'll start to see fairly widespread implementation of large language models across healthcare. Now, exactly what form they might not be literally telling patients what to do, but they're almost certainly going to be there doing a lot of the administrative work that I just talked about a moment ago. I definitely hope to see some of that in there as well. And of course, when I'm talking about the kind of high income, or the upper end of the economies around the world. It's going to be different in different places, but I certainly expect that to see a little bit of that. I expect telemedicine to have continued as well, but possibly settled more into being used like video consultations and remote monitoring into rather specific use cases as well. I think that will be more common practice. But barring any other sort of major technological evolution, I think we'll still be using smartphone type devices. I think even if Apple comes out with a really lovely device next year for its VR headsets, I've been observing that for a long time, and the growth is rather steady more than anything else. So we might start to see some of it being used in healthcare. So it's going to be recognizable, apart from that wild card of large language models. I think that's going to be the interesting one.
Yeah, and I know there's some talk of regulation, which I want to come back to as far as LLMs in AI and healthcare. But I love what you said about not knowing it's AI anymore. So we become so accustomed to things that we already use, like a Siri or a GPS or even chatbots and customer service, that we don't really think of it as new and innovative because it just is. So I think that's interesting to think about it in terms of, in 5 years, some of the things that are revolutionary right now are just, I can't believe this is AI, or, diving into Chat GPT and looking, wow, this is amazing. Things are just going to be, that's what it is. We just use it on a day-to-day or weekly basis. So I think that's also a great point to kind of think about what's new now in 5 years. It's just this is how we do healthcare.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I've always sort of talked about like healthcare being at least a decade behind what we do in our normal lives, so to speak. I think that's narrowing, but like think about how you live your life technologically outside healthcare right now. And then 5 years time, you might see that transition across a little bit. So we talked about smart speakers and voice assistants. I use that all the time, but for rather specific things like timers in the kitchen, listening to music on the radio, getting some facts and information, turning lights on and off, that kind of stuff. I can imagine that being in practice, not just like being there to transcribe and summarize the notes of the patients that I've seen, but also acting as a kind of voice assistant as well, to be able to do some follow-up actions and so on. I can see that being the case. Mind you, it's still kind of overdue. And I think that comes down to just like practice as well, like what we're used to at home versus what we're used to at work.
Yeah, and I think it's fun making predictions to see what actually comes true and what lags behind, because I know the VR headsets were sort of like the big thing. It's taken a long time to adopt things and really get the product out to the market for people to use on a daily basis or a weekly basis. So yeah, I think I'm always curious to hear people in the industry, what their expectations and predictions are. And then, in 2028, we can come back and look at this and see what actually came true.
Yeah.
But with the regulation piece and responsible AI, I know you're passionate about combining technology and healthcare in the pursuit of really making an impact and really doing good. So the regulation of AI is a hot topic, privacy concerns, bias, things like that, not only here in the US, but in the UK as well. So how do you see regulations taking shape, and will it inhibit AI's ability to quote unquote do good in healthcare?
Yeah, that's such an interesting area just now. And what makes it even more interesting is that artificial intelligence doesn't just affect healthcare, it affects kind of every aspect of our life. And, earlier on this year, there was the open letter from people like Steve Wozniak and Elon Musk about pausing development and, some really hyperbolic claims about how the world is going to be transformed and people are going to lose their job or all that kind of thing. So the differentiator here is that what used to be sort of constrained to medical devices with some of the technologies is now literally across everything. And what that then means is that different regions in the world are approaching this in a very slightly different way. And so when we look at the European Union, for example, the European Union has recently brought out or bringing out a number of different sort of regulations and standards about the use of artificial intelligence, which actually seen from the outside is actually pretty restrictive. It takes a really sort of risk-based approach to things and actually almost bans the use of some technologies in some areas as well. For example, for emotion recognition and so on like that. But I understand why they're doing that, because technology is moving so very fast and it takes such a long time to get regulation in place that you have kind of one opportunity every so often to try and reset things. And they've tried to go a bit more broadly because large language models maybe caught them a little bit on the hop. But I think the net result of that is that it is actually quite tight compared to other territories. Whereas when you look in the United States, and actually there's been a few different things. There's the Algorithmic Accountability Act, which is, I understand, going through in the US right now, or rather it's going through your government processes. And that looks at a little bit more intelligently at measuring the impact of these implementations of artificial intelligence on society or in the intended place, as opposed to on a kind of per product basis. It's slightly more flexible. And then you've also got the rise of this sort of non-device status in healthcare as well, where clinical decision support systems powered by artificial intelligence may actually not be considered a device at all. In fact, the only thing that you'd have to prove is that you are not a device, and then you have to sort of comply with all the usual best practice, but that might be out of the place. So there's definitely the beginnings of clear water appearing between some territories, still underpinned by a commitment to doing good, ethical practice, and so on, but some more flexibility and tolerance for risk. And the UK is in an interesting position because the UK, having gone through Brexit, sits outside the EU, but is extremely close to the EU, and a lot of our laws are very closely aligned as well. So as we in the UK come up with new laws and new guidance over the coming year, there's some coming out soon. The question is whether will the UK be more closely aligned to the US, or will it be more closely aligned to Europe? And traditionally, it's been more closely aligned to Europe, but the UK government has got a real appetite to try and drive investment in the UK. So I think this is going to be a really interesting area to watch. And then the rest of the world is pursuing a lot of different approaches. And I think what's interesting about this is that actually with AI, we actually do face a kind of geopolitical sort of decisions. The promise in some regards is very, very high. And in some territories, they may choose to take advantage of these benefits, but be maybe a little bit more risk tolerant of some of the other things to move ahead. And like all things in regulation, everything's fine until something happens and then it swings back the way. So it's going to swing to and fro a little bit, but there is a little bit of a gap opening up between the US and UK, and I think US and Europe and potentially the UK. So the US is quite interesting from that regard right now. The EU is slightly more kind of head scratching as to how we get around it. But fundamentally, regulation is absolutely needed. We just have to make sure that it adapts to the technology as it changes.
And I think hopefully having the regulations be in the best interest, of course they will, but enabling that still AI in healthcare to do good, to have the impact that it's meant to have, because I think of all of the potential that really how it can shape healthcare. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, especially country specific. So will it be different in the US and the UK and Europe and other countries, or will it eventually lead to maybe some sort of centralized, like everyone kind of agrees on something, but yeah, needed. And I also think people's eyes are on this topic because as it's kind of really exploded in the last year or two, people are on one side or the other, more regulations, less regulations. So
absolutely, yeah. And actually, Jen, you made a really good point a moment ago, is like the question is doing good versus doing harm. These are sort of ethical principles here as well. And regulation might balance itself by saying, well, look, we're principally involved in avoiding doing harm. And then it's a balance between doing good and doing harm. But as we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what if this, what if that, we always have to remember that there is harm perpetrated in not taking action. And one of the great statistics, well, it's not a great statistic, it's a horrible statistic, but it's a really telling one, is that back in 2017, I think this figure came from, so the situation is going to be worse now. It's that 50% of the world's population, currently just over 8 billion, does not have access to healthcare, or at least ready access to healthcare. That's over 4 billion people do not have ready access to healthcare. And could some of the technologies we have alleviate that? Undoubtedly, yes. Could it cause some harm? Potentially, yes, as well. But the question is it right if we hold up that development and therefore thwart the ability to provide care for people around the rest of the world? And my strong belief is that technology and automation is utterly critical to solving that problem, because let's face it, does anyone honestly believe that we can train enough doctors, nurses, and human practitioners to provide care for everyone on Earth? We're doing a bad job of it right now, and I can't see us with lots more money and lots more people to do it. So it has to be part of the solution. This is where the balance lies.
Yeah, and I know there will be eyes on this topic as exactly what you're talking about, with the potential for AI to reach the people that don't have healthcare and to make an impact in that. And will the regulations slow that down? Will it inhibit the power of that? So we are going to wrap up, because I know you're a busy guy, you have lots going on, but I wanted to thank you so much sharing your expertise with us. And also, as a physician, I think it's even more interesting to hear you talk about the adoption of AI within healthcare, because you have, as you said at the beginning, such a powerful position, such a unique position to impact other physicians and other doctors to help them adopt in a seamless way, in a more, just a way that meets them where they are, because of people just adopt it. And it's like, but there's constraints, there's burdens, there's time management issues. So thank you again for coming on, and we so appreciate it. And we will link to your website, your LinkedIn above, and we appreciate it so much. Thanks again, Dr. Keith Grimes, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.